Okay, so self self-esteem, still ongoing with theories. So the sociometer theory was offered by Mark Leary, um, and he said that self-esteem is really a gauge that monitors the quality of relationships that we have with others. They aren't always going to be friend relationships or romantic relationships. It could be competitive relationships, like with a classmate or a coworker or something. It could be more of a competitive thing. But really, he's saying relationship as far as like how do I relate compared to somebody else? What is the relationship between my performance and their performance, or my value and their value, or things like that? People who have higher self esteem benefit from it because it minimizes the likelihood of social rejection. So if you think better of yourself, people are less likely to reject you, for one thing. And then also, if you were to maybe initiate a friendly encounter with somebody and they kind of rebuff you, you're less likely to internalize it as a rejection. You're more likely to internalize it as, just a passing chit chat that didn't go any further, and you don't really think about it as a hit to your self esteem. So, having that higher self esteem makes people less likely to reject you and makes it less likely that you feel rejected if it were to happen. High self esteem, he says, this tendency towards monitoring our relationships really comes from our ancestral history where we have this drive to belong to a group. I mean, if you think about it, in our ancestral past, like way caveman lived in clans kind of past, the probability of an individual surviving on their own was really small. And one of the most powerful things that clans had at their disposal when someone violated norms or whatever was probably ostracism, kicking them out, getting rid of them. They wouldn't kill the person directly necessarily. Instead, they just let nature take its course more than likely. So this drive to belong to a social group is really powerful. It's like life and death, this need to belong. And so when Maslow talks about this belongingness need, you can imagine it's a powerful need. It's probably not far off from the safety needs, right? So our relationships tend to improve when we have a lot of the characteristics that are associated with scoring high on a self esteem scale. So, being competent, being likable. People who are physically attractive tend to be regarded more positively than people who are lower in physical attractiveness. So, having a lot of the characteristics that were desirable ancestrally and that continue to be desirable today are associated, and in a lot of self esteem scales are overtly measured as part of self esteem. So he's saying a lot of this is based on very ancestral stuff. Things that can threaten our self esteem, things that happen in public. Again, think about it from like a caveman clan perspective. When you embarrass yourself in front of everybody, when you fall short and everybody saw it or everybody knows about it, that is much more threatening to your sense of self than if you fall short and no one saw, right? Oh gosh, I dropped something and now I have to rebuild it. Oh no. Versus I dropped, oh, I'll give you a great example. I used to be a waitress, and I dropped many a thing back in the kitchen and nobody cared. But if I dropped it out on the floor and customers saw it, way worse, way bigger hit to my waitressing self-esteem than if I dropped something in the kitchen on my way to the bus station or whatever. So yeah, public events, way bigger threat to our self-esteem because people saw it. You can't just sort of cover it up or ignore it. So other things that can lower our self-esteem: when other people criticize us, when other people point out our shortcomings. Yeah, surprisingly enough, that can lower our self-esteem. Feeling like we're being rejected by other people, or being directly rejected by someone else, can lower our self esteem. Maybe I'm unlovable. Maybe I'm unwantable. Maybe these things that I thought were positives in my personality are actually negatives in my personality. Maybe my whole sense of self is off now that this person rejected me. I thought I knew who I was. I thought I knew whether I was valuable to other people, but now I'm questioning the whole thing, right? So you can imagine that rejection would really cause, some self-reflection that could be, not flattering. So we probably don't want lower self-esteem, but why do we want high self-esteem? Um, for one reason, Rogers really argues that when we feel good, we do good. He didn't say it in that phrase, that's a more modern term, but he really made the argument that you, when you feel good about yourself, you tend to be more open in your relationships, you tend to be more accepting in your relationships, you tend to do nicer things for people. In modern research, they talk about people who are feeling good about themselves are more likely to do favors, they're more likely to help someone. So there's a lot of benefits that way. Rogers says that you can't truly love someone else until you love yourself. And I think Erickson would kind of agree with that. Like, you can't really truly know somebody until you know who you are. And ideally, on the positive side, you know who you are and you like yourself. So I think Erickson would probably agree with that. But Rogers overtly says you cannot truly love anyone else until you love yourself, he says. I would soften it to you can't really love someone else until you at least respect yourself. That doesn't necessarily mean that you love every detail about yourself, right? I don't know. I don't know. You might not love every detail about the person that you love. When we are experiencing higher self esteem, we tend to show greater striving towards our goals. We are more likely to stick to it. We are more tenacious. So that's a benefit. We're more likely to achieve our goals if we're more likely to stick to them. So that's a benefit. But I definitely wanted to spend a second talking about some of the dark sides of self esteem. A lot of times, people, Rogers, for example, argue that there's no downside. Like, good self esteem, higher self esteem, greatest self esteem, all of these are great. These are all awesome. But more recent researchers have been pointing out that there are some dark sides to self esteem. Roy Baumeister is one of the top researchers on this issue of some of the dark sides of self esteem, and he says the societal pursuit of high self esteem for everyone may literally end up doing considerable harm. He really points to something that was very popular in the late 90s and early 00s, which was like these self esteem boosting exercises in school. I don't know if any of you experienced that growing up in the K through 12 system, but there were like, I went to my daughter graduated high school in 2011, so she would have been in the perfect elementary school years to experience some of this. We went to a musical performance one night, and literally the choir sang about why they were so great. They literally were singing their own praises in this choir, the group of kids from the school. And I was like, wow, Baumeister's right. They are doing this stuff in the schools. And he was making the argument that this kind of approach was probably in the long run going to be harmful. So he's done a bunch of research on some of the dark sides of self-esteem, and one of the things that we see is that violence is associated with self-esteem. He went into the prisons and he kind of thought what everybody had been saying, what Rogers had been saying, that when people are mean to each other, or people are harmful to each other, or people exhibit violence towards other people, it's really a manifestation of their own low self-esteem. That it's like overcompensation, to use a Freudian term, right? They're trying to make themselves feel better, or at least make other people think they feel better about themselves by acting out in this violent way. So he went into the prison system to see if that was true. And what he found is that people in prison for violent offenses actually scored higher on a self esteem scale than the average college student does. That's not great, honestly. Um, so, murderers, rapists, domestic abusers were scoring higher on the self esteem scale than the average college student. Um, Violent members of hate groups, not just people who belong to a hate group and say mean things amongst each other, but actual members of hate groups who have done actual violent acts um, tend to have higher self esteem, and they tend to have higher levels of education than the average person who does not belong to a hate group, and certainly who has not acted violently on behalf of a hate group. And they tend to have higher career aspirations for themselves. They think that ultimately they're going to be in positions of power or prestige. So that seems like self esteem, doesn't it? One of the things I want to qualify on the murderers, rapists, domestic abusers issue is that when you administer a self esteem scale to a person who wants you to think that they have high self esteem, they may answer in ways that are not consistent with what they really believe. So we have to keep that in mind, that the murderers, rapists, domestic abusers data, that may be like a projection or an overcompensation that we're seeing from the inmates that are there for these violent offenses. The violent members of hate groups, this is them, like the better them thinking that they deserve better, higher level careers. That's them literally thinking they're entitled to that. And so this is a person who's having inappropriately high self-esteem. So I've got a couple of videos that are loaded up for you to watch in the playlist. They're a little bit older because, like I said, this self-esteem movement in the schools was, late 90s, early 00s. So I've got a couple of different videos that I want you to check out on this issue. And then we'll come back and I'll give you a little test. So I'll see you on the other side.